Anyone who's tuned into Drive Time, say Pat Kenny show will have heard your dulcet voice over the years.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Well, I've spent a long number of years working in the media, and mostly with Wicklow People, the Irish Independent, and East Coast Radio and RTE. And over the years, we've come up with so many ideas to cover stories, to do things new ways. You're always trying to, grab the listener, grab the viewer. Most of my work has been done in radio. So I just want to talk to you tonight about a few of the ideas we had and how we implemented them. And I think one of the first things that you must take into consideration is that if you believe in something, you've got to go with it. And this has got me into trouble a bit over the years, but I've always done it. And the first story I want to tell you about is one that went viral. It was just into the new century. And somebody rang one day. And, you've got to listen to these things and think, would something work here? How can I take it a little bit further? Somebody rang the news desk and said, look, we've a terrible dumping problem down near Naas. Do you want to highlight it? And okay, you could highlight it and you could say, right, there's so much rubbish dumped here today and the big clean up and it's costing so much. And remember, we weren't quite as environmentally friendly back in those days. But anyway, I decided to go out and look at it. And I thought, well, this is happening all over the country. This is not just a once-off. What could we do? And so began the idea of ditch watch. Now, ditch watch meant that I would go out somewhere where there was fly tipping, rubbish, whatever. And I would go through the rubbish and I'd try and identify the perpetrator and bring the rubbish back to them. And the first one we did, it was in this byway in Naas. And I went down, I went through the bags. And in those days, people, they were so innocent. They threw everything out. Prescriptions, kids' drawings. It was so easy to find them. Now they've got too cute altogether. But in that particular one, I found some children's drawings and the school name on them. So I went along to the school, and this is the days before we had such rigid privacy regulations either. And I said to the teacher, could you give me that kid's address? And she did. So I went and I knocked on the door, carrying this bag of stuff. Your man had also dropped off in it 36 bank statements. So I knocked on the door and I said, are you missing anything? And he says, no, why? And, it was so funny because when I was looking for the house, I parked outside and suddenly this man, he was about 6'6", a big burly man, walked along the road, and I thought, please don't go into the house, I'm going to, and of course he did, and he was the one who opened the door to me. And I said, are you missing anything? I said, no. And I said, I think you dumped all this stuff. And he goes, no. And I said, well, your children's drawings are here. Surely you thought more about your kids' drawings. And your bank statements are here. And I see you were overdrawn by whatever it was last month. So your man went absolutely crazy. He said, give it to me. And I said, there's a lot more out there as well, which there was, and it was all his. And I said, I'll give it back to you. I said, but first of all, you've got to clean it up. And I was chancing my arm. And he did. And I followed him out. And I did an interview with him while he was cleaning up. And he agreed to talk to me. And we put it out on air. It was during the time of Pat Kenny on the morning show. And the reaction to it was phenomenal. So I just thought, right, this is a great idea. Let's get out there. Let's find more rubbish. So on the show, I'd say, does anybody know of anything being dumped? And they'd get in touch with us. And one of the most hilarious ones was in Sligo, where we went up to a wood where there'd been something was burnt in it. A pile of rubbish had been burnt, but some of it had survived. And there was a Rose's tin box of sweets. And when I opened it, there was a receipt for a baby buggy. So I went to the address and the guy says, I'll tell him, that's my son. They've got a new baby and they must be burnt. And they were burning the nappies and everything up in the woods. So anyway, he said, I'll give you his address, no problem. So he shopped his son. I went after the son, and the son came up to the woods and met me there with the local litter officer. The litter officers for the county councils were very cooperative, obviously. And there was this fabulous woman in Sligo. She was an ex-school teacher, and she was a real bully. And your man arrives up anyway with his friend, and en route they had bought a wheelbarrow and a shovel to clean it up. And God loved them. They were real innocents. I mean, they were the kind of two little guys who needed a hug more than anything else. They were about 19 years old, and the girlfriend had this baby, and they didn't know what to do, and they were burning the nappies and so on and so on. And the litter officer stood over them and she says, now clean that up. This is disgraceful. What are you going to do with the nappies next time? And of course I had all this on tape. And it was absolutely phenomenal. The one thing I did notice was, at the time, Pat Kenny was doing the Late Late Show, and they were offering a car, I don't know, was it every week or whatever it was, but several times I'd knock on a door, and you have to identify yourself before you stick a mic in somebody's face. And I said, hello, I'm from the Pat Kenny Show, or Today with Pat Kenny. And immediately, in 2 cases, a man ran out past me and said, did I win the car? Where's the car? I thought that was why I was knocking at the door. But we had the most enormous success with that feature. Another one was on the cliffs in Achill. Somebody had thrown a load of rubbish over the cliffs. And the litter officer at the time there, he was a fabulous guy, and he was also a rock climber. So he scaled down, I think it's about 400 feet or something, and he brought up some of the stuff we found, and we actually found prescription documentation. So it ended up he was prosecuted in court, and the court in Achill at that stage sat every 6 months, and we went down to cover the hearing, and it was hilarious because the electricity kept going out. And when it go out, the judge would say, has somebody got the money for the meter? And one of the solicitors would have to put it in. But he was actually convicted and fined, which happens more now than it used to back then. But the kind of stuff we found in those rubbish dumps was phenomenal. And I think it did help somewhat to alert people to what was going on. We ran that for about 5 years. And at that stage, people were getting cute. They were tearing their names off things and not throwing out the kids' drawings. And it was much more difficult to find them. Then the next really interesting story was, I'd heard rumours that there'd been whole-scale dumping, I mean real serious dumping of tons of waste in County Wicklow, where I live. And I couldn't get this truth on it. And people were telling me bits of things, and maybe it was true and maybe it wasn't. And this dump was on private land. And it was supposed to be a huge big dump, but nobody would tell me about it. The county council told me I was mad, etc., etc. So one October morning at dawn, I decided I'd go in onto the farm and I'd climb into the dump and see if it really existed and was there rubbish in it. And I did. And it was like hitting the mother lode, I mean, this was phenomenal. It was all, I mean, there's still stuff going on in the courts from all of this. We broke the story. I actually broke it on the News at 1 that day because I was afraid of my life somebody else would get it, and then we did the follow-ups and all the other programmes. But it was very interesting because the story existed, it was around, nobody could put their finger on it. And I just thought, right, just go back to the source. What will we do? We'll go in and look. Went in, looked, found it. And after that, when I went public at 1:30 that, or 1 o'clock that day, whatever it was, I got so many phone calls about other dumps. And they identified 7 dumps, including a section of the port tunnel, which at the time was being used for medical waste. And we went down there with the litter people, and we actually found blood-stained stuff and catheters and everything that were coming from the hospitals. Now, the people who were handing this stuff over, believed they were giving it to legitimate contractors who were going to dispose of it properly. And of course, they weren't. Now that story, I mean, you probably all remember the aftermath of it and the court cases and everything. But that began just from a rumour that was going around that I decided to try and check out. Another story I want to mention, it's a very, very funny story actually. You probably remember back in the early days of the new century again, Brian Keenan got married. And at that stage, Brian Keenan was like a star on the world stage. He'd come back from Beirut. The international media were watching every move he made. So when he said he was going to get married, they were all absolutely delighted. And he was getting married. The reception was held in a hotel, which is now closed, in the Dublin Mountains, very near Wicklow. And everybody was looking for the story. There was security, there were security firms hired from England, everything. Now, I wanted the story. And if Brian Keenan was getting married, I wanted that story first. So I did my research. He'd been divorced, so he couldn't get married we didn't have the divorce laws then, but he couldn't get married in a church. He knew that. So it had to be he was getting married in a registry office. So I picked up the phone. There were 2 places they were eligible to get married. One was Mayo, because I think his wife-to-be was from Mayo, and the other one was Belfast. So I rang both registry offices and I said, look, what time is the Keenan wedding? And they said, no, I don't think that's down here. And I knew a registry officer couldn't actually lie, you know. So they both said, no, he wasn't. So I thought, right, the only other place is Dublin. So what we did was, now it was a little bit sneaky. You can walk into the registry office and you can have a route around. And if you're going in looking fairly respectable, you could be with any of the wedding parties turning up. And you can get your hands on the register where they have to sign while nobody's looking, right? So the day I went in there, what did we see in the registry office? They'd signed, they'd been married that morning. Now the wedding wasn't until, the party wasn't until the following day, the reception. And everybody knew this. But they all thought that it was going to be in a little church up in the Dublin mountains, which it certainly wasn't. So you would not believe that, I mean, this is the day before mobile phones, by the way. And there were about 30 different media stations, Sky News, everything, from all over the world, because this was a big story, you know, the Beirut hostage and all the rest of it. And up in the mountains, there were sat vans, all sorts of things. I mean, it was huge, absolutely huge. And what I decided to do was, I was working for the Independent at the time, and I rang the hotel and I said, I'd like to book in for dinner. And they said, okay. Now this is where the reception was the next day, but you can't stay the night or anything. Just, oh yeah, fine. And they said, you're not the press, are you? And I said, gosh, no. And I wasn't, I was the Independent. So, so I hauled along one of the photographers from the Indo, and the two of us went in, and we had a table and we were sitting there. And all I was really looking for was background stuff, you know, as the hotel prepared for the wedding of the year, all this kind of stuff. And I thought I'd get a good story out of this. But anyway, again, we were very, very lucky. I mean, somebody was watching over us. We went in and we're sitting there at the table. And the next thing, there's a big table set beside us with about 15 seats at it. In walks the wedding party. The entire wedding party. The other hostages, Brian Keenan, his wife, close family. And they're all sitting down at this table, and we suddenly realise we have absolutely stumbled on gold here. It is the wedding reception, the real wedding reception. The big party is the next day. So I was wearing a long skirt with a big slit in the side, and I had a tiny biro in my pocket. And like you couldn't, there was no small recording devices or anything back then. There were no mobile phones, there was nothing. But I had a code with the editor of the Herald, Martin Brennan, who wanted it the next morning. And the code was, I was to ring him up from the hotel phone, if we got anything decent, and say, hi Uncle Martin, how's your sore leg? Are you joining us for a drink? And that was the code, okay? So we're sitting there and they all start talking about the wedding. Brian's wife goes out to the loo or something, and two of the others are bitching about her. And I'm writing all this stuff on my leg with my little pen, right? So, it worked awfully well, except that somebody else had to read it back to me. But anyway, we got loads of stuff, and eventually I decided, right, it's time to go over and try and interview Brian. And Brian is sitting there wearing his shirt and bright red braces, and delighted with himself. And I went over and I said, Brian, I'd like to congratulate you on your wedding. And he held up his hand like this with the ring, and he says, what wedding? What are you talking about? And I said, oh, I like your ring, whatever, you know. And I said, are you happy? Oh, I'm very happy, he says. With that, as I expected, the management in the hotel spotted us. And they came over and they said, I'm sorry, you'll have to leave. You're obviously from the media. And, oh, sorry, I'm telling it in the wrong order. With that, I went out to the phone. And before I spoke to Brian, and I went out to the phone and I said, hi Martin, I said, how's your sore leg? Are you coming to join us for a drink? But he got overly excited and he said, what? Did you get something? Are they married? What? You know, and he ruined it. So they were listening in on the phone. That was what happened. So I thought, right, have to act very quickly. Went over to Brian, said, Brian, are you happy, whatever, you know? So I thought, right, that's okay, have my story, we'll go. So they were throwing me out and I said, does this mean we don't have to pay? And like the Herald thought we were having a cheese sandwich, we were having a 4-course dinner because we had to look the part, you know. So anyway, they called in security and they had brought over this team of, I mean, it was so crazy. There was a security firm from England with guard dogs minding the hotel. So we were escorted off the premises by guard dogs and English security men. So anyway, the next morning I went straight up to watch what was happening and do a follow-up. Couldn't get in at this stage, everything was closed off. And all the security, all the media were there. So at one stage anyway, the paper came on the streets, probably about 10:30 or 11. And some guy from Sky News got up on a bank and he started shouting, "Shut up everybody, shut up everybody." We all shut up, of course. And he says, "The Herald's on the street and some bitch called Cox says they're already married." And but it was a wonderful scoop, it really was. But it's, this is what you have to do. If you get an idea and you want to run with it. Another wedding, I was very good at crashing weddings. I also crashed the Conran wedding. This was in Wicklow, this is St. John's Church. Terence Conran's daughter was marrying. And all the celebs were there. And again, there was a security firm, and they blocked off the laneway up, and I couldn't get up. But I lived in Downlock at the time, and I knew there was a back entrance to the church if you crawled over a couple of walls. So I decided I'd do that. So when I got over the second wall, I was on the entrance to the church. Everybody was walking up, and Paddy Maloney was coming along, whom I knew. I said, "What are you at?" And I said, "I need to get up there. I need to get the story." And he said, "Sure, come on, take my arm." So the two of us marched up. Got to the top, and of course I had no invitation, and so I left him there, and I started mingling. And Bob Geldof was there, and at that stage he was big news because there was rumours of him splitting with Paulie Yates. So I went up to Bob and I said, "Is it true your marriage is on the rocks?" So he told me to fuck off. But anyway, I got the story. Oh, and the night before I had wandered down to John Borman's. It was John Borman's daughter. Was marrying Terence Conran's son, that was it. And I went down and they were getting everything ready. So I got a clipboard, always get a clipboard, it gets you in anywhere. And they were putting up tents and flowers, and I had my clipboard wandering around. Yeah, nice flowers and tents and all that. And I got a lovely background story, but which we used then in conjunction with the wedding. But the really funny thing was, they sold the pictures to Hello magazine. And when the magazine came out, there was a picture of guests arriving, and there I was with Paddy Maloney walking up to the chair. So, I mean, they're just some of the stories that I've worked on. There's one other one I want to tell you about. This was hilarious. Somebody said to me one day, "Did you ever think of investigating Irish psychics live and the whole psychic phenomenon thing? Because people spend a lot of money and so on. I mean, you know all this now. And there's other regulations in place now. It's a bit different." So I thought, great, So I was chatting to Pat and we said, "What do you think?" He said, "Yeah, we'll just go for it." So we had to get permission from the Director General to do surreptitious recording. So I had the time of my life. I rang every psychic on the map practically. And I'd ring up, would record the conversation. And I mean, just absolute rubbish, the stuff. And they tell you, somebody you once loved comes to sit beside you in the middle of the night. Another guy offered me, he said, "I think you're very psychic." He said, "I could give you cut price classes." And another one then said to me, very shortly before we broke the thing on air, he said, he said, "Your mum is looking over you. Your mum really loved you and she's looking over you." And this really concerned me because my mum was alive and well and living in Avoca. So, but it was funny because we were going on air that morning to break the whole story. And we had fantastic stuff on tape, really fantastic. And just before we went on air, Pat said to me, "Are you telling the story about your mom?" And I said, "Of course I am." And he says, "Would you do me a favour?" He said, "Would you ever ring her before we go on air and make sure she's all right?" So she was. So we went on air and it caused terrible trouble. The psychics all went after us, of course. The people who organised it went after. I mean, there was murder for months on end. But it was a great story and it really grabbed people. And then we were taking calls from people who had lost maybe 6,000, I think was about the biggest, to listening to psychics telling her that her husband was still in love with her even though he passed on. I mean, really, we did a public service. It was absolutely appalling what happened in that instant, Then, you'd get ideas for things that you'd feel might help somebody or might make a difference. And one of them was, I was very friendly with Brother Kevin. You all know Brother Kevin in the Caption Day Centre in Dublin. And this particular year, it's only about 6 years ago, he was really struggling, absolutely no money. And I thought, if we brought the programme from the centre coming up to Christmas, he was all on for it. Huge work, because we had to track down all these people, do pre-interviews and so on and so on. So we moved in and we had the Dublin Gospel Choir and it was a fabulous show. But Pat and I decided from the beginning that we would unashamedly beg for money throughout it. So every so often we say, and if you really want to help Brother Kevin, do this, do that. And to be honest, people were wonderful. His clients all talked to us, anonymously of course, but their own voices and so on. And at the end of the day, we actually raised about 350,000, which we were delighted with, because sometimes, instead of just finding the negative and so on. But I also believe very firmly that if there's something you feel you should go with, you should go with it. This has resulted in me being fired twice. I was news editor in East Coast Radio, and our county councillors were going abroad rather a lot. And I decided I would start meeting them at the airport on their return, particularly when they were really tired after a long flight. And I'd ask them how the trip went. And there was one particular trip which was amazing. I think it was 8 of our councillors went to a conference in Florida. And the theme of the conference was high-rise housing in Malaysia, right? Which is very useful for County Wicklow. So I decided I'd meet them at the airport. And they got really annoyed about this. I also contacted a photographer who was living in Florida, and they went around getting photos of them. And there was one of a councillor standing beside Mickey Mouse. There was another one of a guy lying beside the pool, an elderly guy, and he did it. Do you remember in the old days, the way men used to get a hanky and tie the knots and put it over their head? And he was like, I had all these brilliant photographs. And I was working for both East Coast Radio and The Independent. So we published all the photographs, and they were there to greet them when they came home. And I met them at the airport, and one of them got so annoyed with me from behind, he pushed me with the trolley, and I ended up flat on my back. And of course there were photographers there, and the thing went absolutely viral. But anyway, I met them on several of their trips back. There was one where they went to Copenhagen, and it involved a 4-day cruise as well. But anyway, the county manager was chairman of the board of the radio station, and I got fired because I was told I couldn't do any more negative stories on Wicklow County Council. I couldn't do I was not to go to any more council meetings, and I was to leave them alone. So I said, well, absolutely not. I mean, that is not the way a newsroom operates. And so I was fired. So, and funny enough, as I was leaving the building with my bags and baggage, there were photographers in the front garden getting pictures. And I'd been stringing for Morning Ireland at the time. And I will never forget Shane McElhatton, because he rang me the next morning and he said, look, if they don't want you, come on in and work with us. And that was how I started working full-time with RTE. And, but you do have to speak out a little bit. And I'm very much against ageism in this country, which is rife. And the way we treat our older people in this country is appalling. And about 2 years ago, I was 65, so I got fired by RTE. And fired from my second job in RTE, which was, it says in the papers, which had no age limit on it. And I just thought, I have to stand up for this. This is awful. So I took a case against them in the WRC, and I won. And RTE were found guilty of ageism. And all I had looked for was reinstatement, because that's all I wanted. I loved working in RTE, never had a problem with it. It is a wonderful organisation for a reporter, for somebody who wants to do all sorts of interesting stuff. And you could do wonderful stuff. I mean, I was over in Sri Lanka just after the tsunami. I was in Vietnam when there were bombs being, there was just so much. I was in Syria covering stories. And it is a wonderful, privileged existence, if that's what you like doing. But RTE were found guilty of ageism anyway. And it did get a lot of publicity because people were kind of waiting for someone to take that kind of a case, I think. I'm going to stay quiet now because I could go on about ageism all day, and how we need to speak up against it and what's going on in right across things. The media, the medical services in this country, all of this. I mean, I've been very involved in that for the last couple of years, and I'm now working with an organisation. I work as a freelance journalist, and I'm working with Sage Advocacy, which is an organisation that looks after the needs of older and vulnerable people. I only got involved with them a few months ago, but it's a wonderful organisation, and we do things like helping people to get out of nursing homes and go back to their own home if it's feasible, reuniting them with their money that their neighbour might be interested in, all of that kind of stuff. It is wonderful. So that's what I'm doing now, and I'm writing a few books as well, and I have a lovely life. So thank you very much for listening to all of that.